Hey guys, this is Bruce, and welcome to another episode of Information Assurance, and where we're talking about cybersecurity. We're talking about information assurance for an ISO. We've been walking through the IA controls, identification and authentication. In particular, we're talking about all the family of controls. Here we are right here in the family of controls. Let's make this a little bit bigger for you. There's 20 different families of controls in the NIST 800 series of controls. NIST 800, just to kind of recap, NIST 853 is a security standard. And it's just like an ISO 27001. It's like a PCI compliance. It's like essentially what it is a set of rules and best practices that an organization, if they do all of the phases of this particular risk management framework, they'll be more secure. And it's a requirement actually from the federal government. And there's also requirements for banking. There's requirements like HIPAA for hospitals. In the same way, you have that for federal government. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about all the family of controls, and that's what you see on the screen. There's 20 families of controls, and we're going to focus on identification and authentication. There's 12 different controls in identification and authentication. We're not going to hit all of these. Actually, each one of these has a breakdown of several other controls, or some of them do, and we're not going to hit all of them. We're just going to kind of hit all the most important ones, the ones that you see more often, and the ones that are really going to need your time to interpret. So let's kind of go through these and recap. So identification and authentication is having a unique user for every person who's on your network. Authentication is having a unique code to identify that person, to authenticate who that person is, or verify who that person is. You can do this with not only PINs and passwords, but also with biometrics, something you have, something you know, something you are. And then you've got multi-factor authentication, which uses something you have, something you know, or something you are, or you can actually just use two different codes, like a password and a code. You could use two different biometrics, like your thumbprint and your facial recognition. It just depends on how the organization implements that. And there's many different companies that have different solutions for multi-factor authentication, and those are the ones that you see on the screen: RSA and Duo and some of the other ones. We talked yesterday about IA-1, which is policy and procedure. Whenever you have, in the NIST anyway, whenever you have a -1, IA-1, AU-1, you're talking about policies, procedures, written documents that the organization is supposed to have. And then there's supposed to be certain things inside of that documentation. Yesterday, we covered that. We covered what is supposed to be in there. It basically covers a who, what, when, where, and why that the organization uses for that particular control, and IA controls are no different. So we talked a little bit about what you see in a policy. We kind of broke that down. I showed you a couple real policies from like real life policies out there. And pretty soon I'm going to show you where you can download these and have more in-depth details about this particular control and others as we go forward in the week. We talked about processes, what those look like. Today, we're going to talk about IA-2, identification and authentication, and implementation of that within a company, within an agency, within a department. So typically, us, speaking from our perspective as cybersecurity people, as information system security officers, whatever role that they call you, what we're doing is making sure that the organization meets this particular control. Now, you would think that you go there. Why? You might say, Bruce, well, why would we need to validate this? We already know that they're using username and passwords. Well, no, you really don't, because you'd be surprised. Sometimes the organization changes. Sometimes the organization will bring in new systems. In fact, they do it all the time. You have a new system, and yeah, okay, they implemented username and passwords, but what if they have default passwords? What if they have username and passwords, but that's not what the organization uses. Maybe the organization uses biometrics of some sort. Maybe they use RSA keys. So our job as cybersecurity people as information security officers, security compliance people, is to ensure that the organization is meeting the letter of the law, making sure that they are meeting the policies. If there's, no matter what, if there's a change, if they add more systems in, whatever the case may be, if they go from one operating system to another, they have to meet this. They have to comply with the policies, and the policies comply with the state, the federal, and the industry standards. Industry standard would be, an example would be HIPAA that I've mentioned before for healthcare industry, or if you're in retail, it'd be PCI compliance. That's a standard to make sure that your credit cards transactions are secure when you're using machines at the gas station or at Target or at Walmart or wherever you go. So that is what we're doing. We're making sure that they're actually implementing these. And now there's no specific, what the NIST does is it's not very specific on what you're going to do. Like they say, you should have some sort of identification and authentication. And they actually give you some examples of that, but they're not telling your organization that everybody must use multi-factor authentication. No. So that's your job. Your job is to make sure that they are, if in their policy they say everyone will use multi-factor authentication, then when a system comes in, they better be using multi-factor authentication. Now, are there some caveats to that? Are there some times when that doesn't happen because of whatever reason? Yes, of course. And that is really what our job is all about. We tailor those controls because there's going to be times when they can't have a multi-factor authentication on that particular system. Why? Because the system, it's an antiquated system. Why do they have an end-of-life system? Why is it antiquated? Maybe they have a software that's super critical that they couldn't update, and that they have a plan to update, but it's going to take millions of dollars and 2 years to do, right? So they have to put it on Windows 2003, and it's been on there, but they can't put multi-factor authentication on that system. It has a username and password, but that's when you do things like you do compensating controls. You would do something like it's air gap. That means it's not connected to any network. So that's where our job comes in. It's interpretation of the controls and making sure we do common sense controls on the system, making sure that the risk is low. Even though we couldn't meet the letter of the law and the policy, and say the federal law says that everyone will have multi-factor authentication, we come in and say, okay, well, we can't have it, and here's why. But even though we couldn't have multi-factor authentication, here's what we're gonna do. So that's kind of most of our job is doing stuff like that. It's because it's not a one size fits all with security. And that's the great thing about having so many controls in the NIST. All right, so that is IA-2. Now, IA-2 breaks down in many different what's called control enhancements, which we're going to talk about. So one of those control enhancements is IA-2-1, IA-2-1, which is multi-factor authentication for privileged accounts. Why you do that? So for privileged accounts, the reason why you want to have it for privileged accounts is because privileged accounts are super important. A privileged account means like an administrator account, a domain administrator account, or whatever, right? But this person has more privileges than most other normal users because they got to do their job. They have enough privileges to do their job. So let's say that they need to set up servers. To set up a server, you have to be an admin for that. To go and reconfigure a system, to go and change the audit logs, to remove the audit logs, or whatever you have to do to configure the back end of that system, you have to have a privileged account or an administrator account. So one of the rules is an IA-2-1 is multi-factor authentication on all privileged accounts. And the reason why you do that is because that account, somebody got into that and they use a regular username and password and they brute forced a username and password. Well, they got the keys to the castle, Now there are times, again, where you have to tailor this. I've been to many organizations where they, for whatever reason, the administrator cannot have, or certain administrator accounts cannot have multi-factor authentication, right? And then you just have to have a justification. The organization has to have a justification of why they don't have a multi-factor authentication on that account. And that's where we come in. That's our job, to tailor the controls to this organization. We're not saying we're not going to implement this. We're saying, here's why we can't do it. Here's the business justification or the mission justification of why we can't. But here's a compensating control. That means here's what we're doing instead of this. We couldn't remediate this. That means fix the system. We couldn't make it so that they have multi-factor authentication, but here's what we're doing instead. So that is where a lot of our job is making documentation for that, talking with administrators to when they explain to us why, we've got to go interpret that to leadership. It's a lot of like our job is a lot of times it's like interpreting the controls and taking something technical. And this is why you have to be a little bit technical, because you're going to have to talk to technical people. You got to understand what they're saying. And then you've got to go and explain that in manager ease to to explain why you're not able to do it, right? So that multi-factor authentication for privileged account is IA-1. Now, let's go to IA-2. So this one is talking about multi-factor authentication for non-privileged users. Now, this is a trend that's happening throughout the federal government and throughout state governments and any organization who are dealing with systems that are very important. You'll see everyone starting to use multi-factor authentication because it's just getting too easy for hackers and for malicious users to manipulate or brute force attack username and password. It's just getting too easy to hack it. There's just too many loopholes. There's too many ways to get around it, right? Cracking the shadow shadow file, doing a brute force attack on stuff, downloading the hash of it, and then and then breaking the hash and then finding it that way. Or users just losing their passwords. Users writing their stuff down and then hiding it under the keyboard. Mainly it's the users, right? Users using the same passwords on their Netflix account as they do on a government server, right? That happens. So username and passwords are kind of antiquated, and it's just too easy to hack them. It's just too easy to hack, right? So if you put your stuff on Netflix, now I'll give you a better example. PlayStation Network, right? You play PlayStation with your kids, or maybe you're a huge gamer, and you put the same password, username, well, not the username, but the password, the same password, and you use that password with your regular email, your Gmail account, and you use that with PlayStation account network. You log into that. Well, PlayStation got hacked. Their entire database dumped, and it's on the internet being sold on the dark web. And now your password with your username and your full name is out there on the dark web. Now, what they can do is reverse, and they could say, okay, well, who is this guy, John Smith? Okay, johnsmith at gmail.com. Okay, now this person, holy crap, this person works at NASA. Wait a minute. Okay, John W. Smith works at NASA. Does he have a NASA account? Let's see. Okay, he has, so basically they can use personally identifiable information to gather more and more information on you, and then get access to your account at NASA. In theory, right? I don't know, but that's why you want to use multi-factor authentication, because it's just not as username and password is not as safe anymore. So another one. Now, notice we skipped from IA-2 straight to IA-5, IA-2.5, I should say, IA-2.2 to IA-2.5. It's because IA-2.3. This is kind of just a lesson here. IA-2.3 and IA-2.4 have been withdrawn. And that's something that happens a lot with these controls. If we go back to this list of controls here, these controls, they always change, right? So like somebody asked me the other day, they said, hey, what do I need to memorize every single control? There's hundreds of controls, 20 families, but hundreds of actual controls, because they break down and further, which you're seeing right here. But they change all the time. So why would you memorize them? Just use this as a reference. Use it's NIST 853. That's your reference. Use that as a reference. It's kind of like asking an auto mechanic if they remember every single part on a car. Of course not, right? There's going to be parts that they don't know. I mean, I'm sure that they have some idea of what part, where everything goes, but there's something like, I don't know, 17,000 parts on a car. There's going to be certain parts, like little tiny knickknacks and bolts, that they're going to be like, where does this thing go? So that's kind of like what's going on with this. There's just so many moving parts. You couldn't possibly, even if you did memorize it all, it changes so often that it's like, you might as well just use it as a reference. Just just for assurance. Okay, let's get back to where we were here. IA-2.5, individual authentication with a group account. So group accounts, just kind of a little bit of information. First of all, what is a group account? So a group account, there's some cases where administrators or operators in an organization, standard users, will have a need to have an account that everyone shares. And that's a group account. It could be, or you could have like a guest account that only contractors, they come in, they got to do their work. You know that they have a limited, they're only going to be there for a few hours, but they have to use the system. Okay, here's a shared account to get access to the quick access to the, I don't know, the Wi-Fi or something. It's a shared account that everyone can use to get into the Wi-Fi, right? The problem with shared accounts is that people, if everybody's sharing the same username and password, somebody's going to share it to somebody else. I mean, it's just a matter of time. A short amount of time it's going to happen. It's going to get compromised. Another thing that can happen is somebody can mess around. Like somebody could download illegal stuff. Let's say they have a shared account, a guest account, and one person, you have Monday through Friday, people can use this guest account, right? Monday through Friday, you don't know who is logging into this guest account that you have that's out in the lobby or whatever. Somebody gets a hold of that thing and does something stupid with it. This just human nature. Somebody's going to try to do something with it that they're not supposed to do. They start downloading illegal material off the internet. Well, who did it? Right now you got the federal government coming to you because you download some illegal contraband off the internet. There's illegal things that if you download it, that whole company could lose their reputation, right? And somebody's using a group account to do some stuff like that. Well, that's the problem with a group account. You know, it's not very safe. You can't track who's doing what. People are anonymous with it, all that kind of stuff. So this control is saying, look, you can have a group account, but it's important that every individual has to authenticate before they use a group account. So what I did was this little picture here is showing one solution for that, where you have domain credentials, like individual users log in, and then they use this product. And this has a shared account, but what this does is it tracks each person who's using that shared account, that shared password, so that somebody does something stupid, you'll be able to track it because they logged in first, so you know who at that time who logged in, and you'll be able to track who did what. So this IA-2.5, which I don't see very often, I don't see a lot of organizations use this, but this is one control that you would use if you are using it. And that's another thing. If your organization has no use of shared accounts, you wouldn't use this control. You'd say it was NA. It's not applicable to your organization because we don't use group accounts at all. Okay, let's talk about IA-2.6. So IA-2.6 is access to accounts, and this is separate devices. So let me explain this one. So this one is using different devices to implement multi-factor authentication, right? So what does that mean? So one of the ways to defeat multi-factor authentication is when people use one device, one system to use multi-factor authentication. You hear about people, their phone getting hacked, and then they lose their SIM card, right? They lose their SIM card, which has access to all their data, and then using that SIM card, since they only have one method of one device to implement their multi-factor authentication, well, it's not going to work, because if they get a hold of your SIM card on your phone, or they cloned your SIM card, well, guess what? They have your multi-factor authentication. So another way people are getting hacked with multi-factor authentication is email. If you use email as your only way of multi-factor authentication, like it sends you a code right to your email account, and then you use that code to get into whatever site, your bank or whatever. If you only have one method of authentication and it's only using one technology, it's actually very risky. So what they're doing here in this control, IA-2.6, is to say, look, you're going to use multi-factor authentication, you have to use multiple devices, right? And I see organizations do different iterations of this. Some of them don't do it at all. But, you know, if they are worth their salt and they have very important data, they are doing this. Because what you want to have is kind of what you have here on this screen. You have two different devices. Like you have your phone, and your phone's going off a SIM card, and you have maybe email that sends a code, and then so that's two separate things. Or better yet, have an authenticator, like an app authenticator that you have access to, right? and you have to log into that thing to get access to that code to get access to this site, to the secure site. So you have two different devices that are implementing your multi-factor authentication. So that's what this control is all about. Now you, as the system security officer, as the cybersecurity person, you would interpret this, and the way that you would assess this or whether or not your organization has it is just by observing. You would observe that, well, whenever we log in, we have to use a push notification from our phone that makes you have a check mark or an X to say if it's approved or not. And then also you have this RSA key or whatever it is, or you have biometrics, your facial recognition or something. You have two different methods. You would observe and say, yep, we're doing this. And then one of the things that we do as cybersecurity people, as information security officers, is we'll do an implementation statement. Say, yep, yay, verily, this is being done. Everything's good with this. The organization is definitely doing this. They're using two different devices. They're using the Cisco system, and they're using push notifications for mobile devices. Not too many of these left, but you'll notice there's so many just with one IA control. We haven't gotten to, so there's IA4, IA5, IA6, I think up to like IA10 or something. So we're just going to cover IA2 today, and then all of the enhancements. So there's not that many left. So IA28 is a little tricky to understand, but I can simplify it. So this is making sure that accounts that you're using in your organization are replay resistance. That means, so there's an attack that's used against authentication called a replay attack, and that replay attack, very quickly, it's just like this image you see here. There'd be a person in the middle that's watching this wire. They're sniffing the communication. That means that they are somehow, some way able to collect all the data. This happens a lot with Wi-Fi, by the way. Somebody will sit at the airport. That's why you never, ever do anything important at the airport. It's just too easy to hack it. So you can sit at the airport while other people are communicating with a server at their job or whatever, or TurboTax or something. And then they authenticate with TurboTax, right? I saw this live at DEF CON, right, many years ago. Never, ever do your taxes at DEF CON, because this is exactly what they're doing. See this picture right here? An army of hackers were watching, sniffing the communications as people are logging on to TurboTax or whatever they're logging on to, and doing, I don't know if they're doing replay attacks. They didn't really even need to. They were just sniffing this, and then somebody sent their taxes over the wire, and then they got it, right, by sitting here and then just gathering all the data that's coming off, because it wasn't encrypted, right? It'd be a different story if it was encrypted, but it wasn't encrypted. So the communication between point A and point B wasn't encrypted. So they were sending their data clear text. Anyway, so let's say that this user is communicating with the server, and they log in with their username John-1, and then they type in their password. They authenticate. Well, somebody here could grab that and then replay that to the server and say, hey, I'm John-1, let me in. So a replay attack resistant means making sure that your organization has some kind of mechanism. They're not specifying what kind of solution you should use, but making sure that you are aware that this kind of attack happens quite often, and that you have some sort of a resistance against it. And this could be just encryption, like really strong encryption. It could be, I've seen a couple of solutions for this, which I thought maybe I put in there, but I didn't. But there's different kinds of solutions that you can use on the server even to make sure it's resistant to the actual replay attack. So I hope that makes sense. There's only a couple more here that we're gonna go through. Oh my Lord, this is so long. Okay, this one's really quick. This is just IA-210, which is single sign-on. It's just providing single sign-on. So you would only do this if this is what your organization does. If you have an organization, or if you're an agency or a department or whatever, and you guys use single sign-on, then you would go ahead and look at this particular control. You would do it within this, what the parameters of this control. That's all you would do. And if your organization is not using any type of single sign-on on a website or within internally, a lot of organizations use it internally because you have whole bunch of websites and stuff that you need to log on internally for single sign-on. So a lot of people use it internally. You would then use this particular control. But if you're not, you would say NA. Not applicable. Our organization doesn't use it. Okay, IA-212. Still on IA-2s. IA-2 is huge. Acceptance of Priv credentials. This is your like a CAT card. If you work for the military, they use what's called a CAT card. Common access card, I think is what's the name. Priv is just a personal identity verification credentials. It's like a little card. You slip that into this little device here, and then that is something you have, and then you type in something like your code or your password or whatever, right? So there's different controls for this particular thing. If you use this, if your organization uses it, there's certain things that you need to do to make sure it's secure. And then lastly is out-of-band authentication. So this is using two different channels to do multi-factor authentication. So an example of this is something all of us actually use. Push notifications, like if you have an Amazon account, or if you have a multi-factor authentication on an Amazon account, they'll sometimes do this push notification to you, and you got to press approve, right, to get in there. Or another one is Adobe uses it, so they'll use like this push notification that's out of band. Out of band meaning it's using a whole separate network to authenticate. Like you're on your computer on this network here, logging into a two-factor authentication to some server somewhere, but then it takes it a step further and it sends you a push notification on a whole nother network where it's not connected to the network you're on. That, I think the idea behind it is that if this channel gets hacked, you still have another factor authentication that's safe. I believe that that's the reasoning behind it, right? I don't really see IA-213 used very often, but there it is right there. So that's it for this one, guys. I got a couple people asking questions. If you guys are interested in learning a lot more about this particular stuff, you can find this on ConvoCourses.com. Just go ahead and type in ConvoCourses.com, and I've got a ton of free stuff, by the way, that you can use. It's some downloadables. This is just one of the many things that I cover. I go in much greater detail. I've got downloadables. I have walkthroughs on how to do the actual downloadables. And like I said, a lot of it is free. ConvoCourses.com. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. If you're interested in this, I'm just trying to pay some bills here. So here it is right here. Again, if you don't have the money for this, a lot of the stuff that I teach is free. You can just go to YouTube and then Google ConvoCourses, and you'll find all of my material. I talk like many different subject topics. But if you want a deeper dive, if this is something you're serious about, if this is your industry, if this is something you're trying to do, if you're trying to learn a deeper dive into best security practices, then yeah, you want this course. But what I'm talking about here is these families of controls. I go very deep into these families of controls. These are videos. These are downloadables. This is AC2. This is AU1. And by the way, I add to this all the time. So as I add to it, the price does increase because it's just more and more hours and hours of content. So this is no joke. This is not a joke, and you will not beat the prices of this particular course. You will not beat this price. So I mean, good luck doing it, but I mean, this is a thousands of dollars course, I'm telling you. Anyway, I've got a couple questions here. Paul says, very good information. Thank you, sir. Well, appreciate you. You're welcome. Godspeed says, for all the government agencies that I work for, no one has ever used group accounts. Yeah, governments are cracking down on group accounts a lot, but I've worked for a couple of organizations that did use them on the back end. They're usually used like on out of band systems, like air gapped systems that are not connected to the network. I've seen them used there. For example, I saw one of the first gigs I worked in the Air Force. This was many years ago. We had an air gapped system. It wasn't air gap means it's not attached to any network, not classified networks, not any networks, right? It was just one standalone computer, and we had a group account to log in to talk about our day. Like if we would tell about what we did during that day, and it had a group account on it. So Let me see. Thank you for going over the controls. You're welcome. Appreciate that. Thanks for watching. It says, is there a difference between CAC and PIV cards? No. That's a great. I used to think that there was a difference. There's not. It's the same thing. It's just the CAC is what the government calls it. Like the government, the U.S. government's like to rename everything. I don't know if you noticed that. They like to have their own name for everything. But a CAC card is a PIV card. So, all right. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong out there, Godspeed or whoever. It says, yeah, it definitely makes sense. Air gap systems are standalone systems. Yeah. So I've seen air gap systems have group accounts because there was just no reason to have an individual account on there. I think probably eventually they made us put in individual accounts on there, but it was just all it was logging our day. It was like having a visitor's log. Like we would just track what we were doing, but we did it on this standalone computer that had no connections to anything, and it had like a simple access device on a simple like database on it that we just use it like almost like a blotter, So that's kind of what we used it for. All right, guys, I've been talking for about 40 minutes. Join me tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel, and we'll talk a little bit more about this kind of stuff. I appreciate you guys. Thank you for watching. I'm gonna try this every day to see how this goes, and